The contraction hit without warning. Amara Voss gripped the bed rail with both hands and pressed her lips together, breathing through her nose in the sharp, controlled rhythm she had practiced for weeks. The pain was enormous, not sharp exactly, more like a tide, something that came from everywhere at once and left no room for anything else. It lasted 43 seconds. She counted everyone. When it passed, she released the rail and lay back against the pillow. The ceiling above her was white and unremarkable. A strip light hummed somewhere to her left. The room smelled of antiseptic and something faintly chemical she hadn't been able to identify since they'd brought her in at 4 in the morning, and she'd stopped trying. She reached for her phone on the bedside table. The screen was black. She pressed the home button. Nothing. She pressed it again, harder, as if firmness might resurrect it. The screen stayed black. 8%. That had been the battery level when she'd sent Kai the voice note an hour ago, or 2 hours ago. She had lost track of time somewhere between the third and fourth contractions, when the gaps had begun to shorten and the world had narrowed to this room, this bed, this ceiling, and the mounting certainty that she was going to do this entirely alone. She put the phone face down on the table. She was not going to panic. Panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford, not in the 29 years of her life, not as the only black girl in her secondary school in Bristol, not when she'd arrived in Seoha City 3 years ago speaking no Korean and understanding even less, not when she'd fallen in love with a man whose name made other men look at the floor. She was not going to start now, 38 weeks pregnant, in a hospital room on the 4th floor of Silvergate General, with no phone and no husband and another contraction already beginning to gather itself somewhere deep in her abdomen like weather. She counted. When it passed, she pressed the call bell. She waited 7 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on the wall above the door, a plain white clock, institutional, the kind that exists in every hospital in every country in the world. The second hand moved with a faint mechanical tick that she had begun to find both irritating and reassuring, the only reliable rhythm in the room. At 7 minutes and 20 seconds, the door opened. The nurse who entered did not introduce herself. She was in her mid-40s with close-cut hair going gray at the temples and the kind of professional efficiency that left no room for warmth. She moved directly to the monitor beside the bed, checked the readout, made a note on her tablet. "I was wondering about the pain relief," Amara said. "The midwife who admitted me said I could." "Everything is being managed according to your birth plan," the nurse said without looking up. "I understand, but the contractions are getting closer together, and I haven't spoken to anyone about the next stage of. These things take time." The nurse looked up then briefly and gave Amara a smile that was technically correct and completely empty. "Try to be patient." She adjusted the IV line. She made another note. She left. Amara looked at the door for a moment, then she looked back at the clock. The second hand moved. Tick, tick, tick. She had noticed it in admissions, 2 hours before, the quality of the attention given to her versus the young Korean woman in the bay beside her, who had received 3 check-ins to Amara's 1. She had noticed the receptionist's slight pause before speaking to her, as though recalibrating. She had noticed the junior nurse who'd taken her blood pressure avoiding sustained eye contact. She was practiced at noticing these things. She was equally practiced at deciding which of them warranted her energy, and right now, none of them did. What mattered was the baby. What mattered was Kai getting here. Another contraction. This one was harder. She gripped the rail and breathed and did not make a sound, because she had decided she would not give this room the satisfaction of her noise. 38 seconds. When it released her, she was breathing hard and her knuckles ached, and the clock above the door said 5:47 in the morning. She had been alone in this room for 2 hours and 11 minutes. If this opening pulled you in, Amara alone, in pain, in a system that has already decided how much she matters, then this story was written for you. Follow for the next chapter, share with someone who needs to read this, and stay with Amara and Kai until the very last line. What happens next will change how you see strength entirely. Kai had known the meeting was going to go wrong before he'd walked through the warehouse door. It was something in the way Ro had looked at him in the car. A fraction too still, the particular stillness of a man who has already processed a threat and is deciding whether to name it. Ro had been Kai's second for 9 years and had never once wasted words, which meant that when he chose not to speak, there was always a reason. The warehouse was on the industrial fringe of Sioha City's eastern district, a legitimate storage facility that Mun's people used as a meeting ground precisely because its legitimacy made it deniable. Inside, 2 men waited at a long folding table, Mun Jeongsu, compact and watchful, who ran distribution across the southern quarter, and beside him, BWAM Chanwook, younger, with restless hands and eyes that moved too frequently to the door. Kai sat down, Ro stood behind him, hands loose at his sides. The meeting was nominally about territory, a corridor in the northern district that 3 organizations had been quietly contesting for 18 months, and which someone had decided needed a formal agreement before it became something messier. Kai had agreed to the meeting because declining would have shown weakness, and because he was, genuinely, trying to reduce the number of things in his life that required warehouses. He was trying to be done with all of this. He had been trying for 14 months, since the night Amara had sat across from him at their kitchen table and said, very quietly, that she was pregnant, and that she needed to know what kind of world their child was going to be born into. He had not answered immediately. He had looked at her for a long time, at the way she held her hands flat on the table, not wringing them, not gesturing, just still, and he had understood that she was not asking him to choose between her and his work. She was asking him to choose between who he was and who he could become. He had been choosing every day since, some days more successfully than others. His phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He did not reach for it. Mun was speaking something about boundaries, about mutual respect, about the value of stability. Kai listened with the patience he had spent years cultivating, the patience that sat on top of other things, deeper things, the way water sits on stone. He watched Mun's hands. He watched BWAM's eyes. He watched the door. His phone vibrated again. Ro shifted his weight barely perceptibly. "You'll excuse me," Kai said. He stood, which he knew would read as presumptuous in this context, and which he did deliberately. He retrieved his phone. The screen showed a voice note from Amara, received 40 minutes ago. He hadn't felt it over the car's engine noise, and below it, a text message time-stamped 8 minutes ago, contractions getting stronger. "Where are you?" He read it twice. He noted the period at the end of the second sentence, which was not how Amara usually punctuated texts. He noted what that meant about her current state of mind. He put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at Mun, he looked at BWAM, he sat back down. "You were saying," he said. The nurse came back 20 minutes later. Amara had not called for her, the nurse simply appeared, the door opening without a knock, which Amara had noted each time as a small, consistent discourtesy. She moved through the room with the same efficient purposefulness as before, but something was different now. Slower, maybe more deliberate. She checked the monitor. She looked at the readout longer than necessary. "Your name is Amara Voss," she said, not a question. "Yes." "Voss is your married name." Amara watched her. "Yes." The nurse set her tablet on the counter without writing anything on it, which was the first time she'd done that. She turned around and looked at Amara directly, the first time she had done that either, sustained eye contact, the kind that takes something from the person offering it and knows it. "You're Kai King's wife." The room changed. Amara felt it physically, a shift in pressure, the way the air in a space changes when something that has been approaching finally arrives. "I am," Amara said. The nurse nodded, as if something had been confirmed that she already knew, as if this entire morning had been a kind of arrival at this moment. She stood at the foot of the bed with her hands at her sides and looked at Amara with an expression that was no longer professionally empty, but something else entirely, layered, controlled, and burning at the center with something that had been burning for a long time. "I've worked in this hospital for 19 years, the nurse said. Her voice was level, conversational almost. 19 years and I have never missed a shift. I have never had a formal complaint. I have received commendations. I have trained junior staff. I have been, by every measure this institution uses, an excellent nurse. Amara breathed steadily. Another contraction was building, distant but distinct, and she could feel her body preparing for it. She kept her eyes on the nurse and her hands loose at her sides. My husband ran a logistics company, the nurse continued. A small business, 15 employees. He had built it over 11 years. She paused. Your husband's organization used my husband's company for a shipping contract 2 years ago. When that contract became inconvenient, your husband's people reported my husband to the financial authorities for fraud, fabricated documentation, targeted, deliberate. Her voice remained even throughout all of this, which was somehow more frightening than if it hadn't. My husband was arrested, charged, tried, convicted on the basis of evidence that we now believe was manipulated, but which no one with any power has any interest in revisiting because the man who provided it is your husband. She tilted her head slightly. My husband is in Meechin prison. My children and I lost our home. I have been working double shifts in this hospital for 14 months to pay a lawyer who tells me there is very little hope. Amara said nothing. The contraction was closer now. I understand, the nurse said, that you are not him. Then step back, Amara said quietly, and be the nurse you say you are. Something moved across the nurse's face. Amara saw it, a flinch or something adjacent to a flinch, and then the closing over of it, the way a wound closes over without healing. She stepped closer instead. The contraction arrived. It was the hardest one yet, enormous and obliterating, and Amara gripped the rail and closed her eyes and breathed and did not make a sound, every muscle in her body concentrated on the single task of endurance. She was 38 seconds into it, eyes pressed shut, jaw set, when the nurse hit her. The blow was open-handed, across her left cheek, and the sound of it in the small room was impossibly loud. The contraction continued. Amara could not do anything about what had just happened because her body would not allow her to stop managing the contraction. She held the rail, she breathed. The contraction peaked and then, in its own time, began to recede. When it was over, she opened her eyes. The nurse had stepped back. She was standing 2 feet away, her hand still raised slightly, her breathing audible now. She looked at what she had done, at Amara's face, at the mark she had left, and something flickered behind her eyes that might have been horror before it was something harder. She lowered her hand. She straightened her uniform. She looked at Amara with the expression of someone who has committed to a course of action and will not be the first to flinch from it. Ring that bell, she said, her voice almost steady, and I'll tell them you became hysterical, that you struck yourself during a contraction. You're a foreign woman, alone, married to a man this city has complicated feelings about. She paused. Think carefully about who they'll believe. She walked out, the door clicked shut behind her. The room was very quiet. Amara lay still. She could feel her cheek, the heat of it, the particular throbbing specificity of it, pain that knew exactly where it lived. She looked at the ceiling. The strip light hummed. The clock above the door said 6:14. She thought about what the nurse had said, not the threat, the calculation. She ran it honestly, the way she ran most things that frightened her, without flinching from the uncomfortable conclusions. A foreign woman, alone, her husband's reputation. The nurse's 19-year record. She thought about all of that for approximately 45 seconds. Then she reached out and pressed the call bell. Once, without hesitation, without drama, because she had decided, and once Amara Voss had decided something, the decision did not revisit itself for renegotiation. She lay back and looked at the ceiling and waited, and the clock ticked, and somewhere below her, in the deep and extraordinary machinery of her body, her daughter continued her steady and unstoppable arrival into the world. The weapon appeared from under the table, which was where Kai had expected it to come from. BWAM had been leaning forward at an angle that suggested access to something beneath his right hand, and the angle had been consistent for the past 4 minutes. What Kai had not precisely anticipated was the second one, held loosely by a man who had appeared in the doorway behind them at some point in the last 90 seconds, quiet enough that even Ro had missed him by perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time, it was also not enough. Ro moved at the same moment the warehouse door opened, a controlled, fast repositioning that put BWAM's arm at a mechanical disadvantage. And in the brief and complicated physical negotiation that followed, the weapon changed hands in a way that left BWAM reconsidering his posture, and the man in the doorway doing a rapid reassessment of the room's geometry. Mun had not moved. He was watching Kai across the table with an expression of professional interest, as though observing the outcome of an experiment he designed but wasn't certain of. Kai's phone rang. It was an unknown number, a Silvergate General main line, he would realize later, patched through to his business contact by a junior nurse who had seen things she wasn't supposed to see and decided, with a courage she probably didn't know she had, to do something about it. He answered it. A young woman's voice, careful and slightly unsteady. "Mr. Kang, this is Silvergate General Hospital. Your wife has asked us to contact you. I think," a pause, "I think you should come." It was the word think that did it. Not the message itself, not the words, but the way she said it, the quality of care in it, the gentleness of someone communicating more than their words were technically saying. Kai looked at Mun. He looked at BWAM, who was now standing against the far wall making careful decisions about his breathing. He looked at the man in the doorway who had quietly and wisely decided to become part of the wall. "We're done," Kai said. He stood, he buttoned his jacket, he looked at Mun directly. "Whatever you were planning after this meeting," he said, not because I'll respond to it, but because I'm choosing not to, and that choice has a time limit you shouldn't test." He said it without heat, without performance. He said it the way he said most things that mattered, as a fact being placed on record. He walked to the door, Ro fell in behind him. In the car, Kai did not speak. He stared through the windscreen at the pre-dawn gray of the Eastern Industrial District, the angular shapes of warehouses and loading bays sliding past. Ro drove without asking for direction. He knew where they were going, and without speaking, which was one of the reasons Kai trusted him more than almost anyone. They moved through the city. The streets were quiet at this hour, the traffic lights changing for nobody, the city between its nighttime self and its morning self belonging entirely to neither. Kai's hands were in his lap. He turned his phone over once. He did not turn it again. He thought about Amara. He thought about the voice note he hadn't listened to until too late. He thought about the text message with the period at the end. He thought about the nurse on the phone saying, "I think you should come," in the careful voice of someone protecting something they couldn't say outright, and he thought about what that protection implied, and the thought sat in his chest like something physical, like a hand closing. He had been late. He had sat in a warehouse with two men who wanted him dead and let his phone vibrate and told himself he'd be there within the hour. And the hour had become 2 hours, and now a hospital was calling him through intermediaries because his wife was, because something had. "Faster," he said. Ro drove faster. Silvergate General's 4th floor was the kind of place that existed in its own particular stillness at 6 in the morning, the lights at half their daytime intensity, the corridors quieter, the sounds muffled as if the building itself was holding its breath between shifts. A porter pushed an empty cart past the elevator bank. A phone rang twice at the nursing station and stopped. Kai walked through it like weather. He knew the room number. He had been given it when Amara was admitted, had carried it in his jacket pocket on a folded piece of notepaper since 4 that morning. He moved through the corridor with his hands at his sides, and his pace just below the threshold that would make people shout at him to stop, because he had learned long ago that the fastest way through a building was to move at precisely the speed that made people uncertain whether to intervene. A receptionist stood up as he passed the ward entrance. "Sir, visiting hours don't." "Room 412, Kai said and kept moving. A security guard stepped into the corridor ahead, broad-shouldered, young, clearly knew enough that he had not yet developed the instinct for which situations required firmness and which required judgment. He positioned himself in the path with the spread-footed stance of someone who had been trained to look immovable. Kai stopped. He looked at the guard for a moment. "My wife is in that room," he said. "I'm going to her. You can step aside now, or you can call your supervisor and I'll speak to them directly, but I will be in that room in the next 90 seconds regardless." He said it without aggression, without raising his voice, without a single inflection that could be called threatening. He said it as a description of events that had already been decided. The guard stepped aside. Kai pushed open the door to room 412. A junior nurse startled from the chair in the corner, where she had clearly been assigned to sit with Amara since whenever. She stood up too quickly and knocked her knee on the chair's arm and said something in Korean that might have been an apology. Kai moved past her. Amara was in the bed. She was upright against the pillow, her hands folded over her stomach, her breathing careful and deliberate. She looked at him when he came in, and something in her face shifted, not relief exactly, not yet, but the end of something. The end of managing entirely alone. Kai's eyes went to her face. He saw it immediately. The left side of her cheek, the particular redness and early swelling of a fresh impact, specific and undeniable, and exactly the kind of mark that a man like Kai, who had seen violence in its many forms for most of his adult life, could read without ambiguity. He went still. Not frozen. Still, the way a person goes still when they are containing something very large in a very small space, and the containment requires every resource currently available. He stood at the foot of her bed and looked at her face for a moment that was probably 3 seconds and felt considerably longer. Amara met his eyes. "I'm okay," she said. "The baby is okay." A pause. "Sit down and listen to me before you do anything." He sat. He pulled the chair from the corner, where the junior nurse was now standing against the wall looking unsure of her geometry, and placed it beside Amara's bed and sat in it and took her hand in both of his. She told him about the nurse's first visit, the coldness, the dismissiveness, about the dead phone, about the second visit, the speech about the husband, the prison, the 14 months. She told him what the nurse had said about what would be believed, and about what she had decided after, and about pressing the call bell once without hesitation. She told him all of it in a measured voice, looking at him directly, not softening any of it and not dramatizing any of it, because she was Amara and she had never done either of those things in her life. Kai listened. He did not speak. He held her hand and listened to every word, and the thing behind his eyes went colder and more settled with each sentence, in the particular way that certain kinds of men become quieter as the thing they are feeling becomes larger. When she finished, he nodded once. He squeezed her hand. He held it for one more moment. Then he stood up, set the chair back against the wall for the junior nurse, and walked into the corridor and closed the door gently behind him. He made the first call to hospital security. He stood at the window at the end of the corridor that looked out over the car park, and he spoke to the duty security manager in a voice of total precision. The nurse's name, which he had just learned from Amara, the room number, the nature of the incident, and a very clear instruction that she was to be located within this building and not permitted to leave until the police arrived. He was calm. He gave his name when asked. He answered the follow-up questions without impatience. The second call was to the police emergency line. He reported the assault factually, the victim, the alleged perpetrator, the location, the time frame, his own name, and a request for an officer to attend. He stayed on the line for 60 seconds to confirm the dispatch. The third call was 4 words, "I need you here." His lawyer, who had been woken from sleep and did not sound unhappy about it, said 30 minutes and hung up. Kai put his phone in his pocket and walked to the nursing station. There were 2 nurses at the station, a senior nurse he hadn't seen before and a young male trainee who looked approximately 19 and terrified in a general kind of way. Kai placed both hands flat on the counter and waited for the senior nurse to look up. I need to speak with the duty administrator, he said. Now please. Dr. Huang won't be available until. Now, Kai said again. The word was not loud. It occupied the space very completely. The nurse picked up the phone. Word moved through the ward the way these things always moved, not through announcement, but through the specific quality of silence that gathers around something serious. Nurses found reasons to be in adjacent corridors. The trainee at the station developed an intense interest in paperwork. Doors opened a fraction and then closed. Rowe appeared at the end of the corridor. He had come up through a different entrance and was leaning against the wall with the patience of a man who had waited in worse places. He looked at Kai across the length of the corridor. Kai shook his head slightly. Not that way. Rowe nodded. He stayed where he was. Security found Nurse Cho Yuna in the third-floor break room, sitting at the small table. With her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and her face arranged in an expression of professional composure. She denied everything fluently, without apparent distress, with the particular authority of someone who had decided on their story early and committed to it completely. She said that the patient had become distressed during a contraction and confused. She said that she had left the room for the patient's benefit when the situation became overstimulated. She said these things clearly and calmly, and with the weight of 19 years of institutional standing behind every word. Then trainee Sue came forward. She came forward at the nursing station quietly, while her supervisor's back was turned, a small, precise young woman who had clearly been composing herself for this for some minutes. She told the security manager that she had been passing room 412 earlier and had heard the nurse make specific comments about the patient's background and her husband, through the partially open door. She said she hadn't gone in. She said she was sorry she hadn't gone in. Her voice shook slightly, but her eyes were steady. A second nurse, a colleague from the overnight shift, came forward 15 minutes later, unprompted, with a different incident from 2 weeks prior. A comment made in the break room about the type of patients the hospital was taking in these days. A comment that had been absorbed into the ambient background noise of working life and not reported because who did you report it to and what did they do with it? And besides, it was just a comment. Yuna was escorted from the fourth-floor ward by 2 security staff. She walked without being held, her back straight, her face neutral. She did not look at anyone as she passed the nursing station. She did not look at room 412. The ward was quiet for a moment after she was gone. Then a door at the far end of the corridor opened, and a woman in scrubs came through it with the kind of walk that belongs to people who have been doing important things for so long they no longer think about how they look doing them, unhurried, grounded, already present. Nurse Lim Boyoung was 52 years old and had been a midwife for 22 years and had delivered, by her last count, somewhere in the region of 340 babies. She had been called in by the nursing station's senior staff as a replacement, and she had arrived with a bag over one shoulder and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the particular quality of attention that Amara felt from 20 feet away through an open door before Boyoung had said a word. Boyoung came into the room and introduced herself fully: name, qualification, years of experience, current role. She shook Amara's hand. She sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at Amara with the focused, unhurried attention of someone for whom patients were not a category but a specific person in a specific moment. I understand you've had a very difficult morning, she said. I'm sorry, what happened to you should not have happened in this building. Is my husband? He's in the corridor, he'll come back in a moment. Boyoung opened her bag and began removing items with methodical calm. Right now I need to know how you're doing, how your contractions are, what your pain level is, and what you need. Tell me everything. Amara told her. Boyoung listened, asked precise questions, examined her with competence and care, and updated the monitoring equipment with the efficient thoroughness of someone who trusted their instruments but trusted her hands more. She noticed the mark on Amara's face without making it the centerpiece. She photographed it, documented it in the chart, said this is being recorded properly and will go into your official file, and moved on without lingering because Amara did not need the worst thing about this morning to be the thing that defined it. Pain relief, BWAM said. Here's what I'd recommend and here's why. Tell me if any of this doesn't sit right with you. She explained. Amara listened. They made a decision together, which was the way BWAM apparently conducted most things. Sorry, Amara said, when BWAM asked about the baby's name. BWAM looked up. That's beautiful, she said, directly, simply meaning it in the specific way that people mean things when they're not performing meaning. Amara felt something ease in her chest. It was not the pain medication that hadn't been administered yet. It was something older and simpler than medication. It was the feeling of being properly attended to, which is one of the most fundamental things a human being can offer another, and one of the most underrated. Director Hwang's office was a small room off the third-floor administration corridor, with a desk that was too large for it and a framed hospital mission statement on the wall behind the chair. Hwang himself was a man in his early 60s who wore the professionally neutral expression of someone who had spent decades managing the gap between what institutions said they valued and what they actually did, and had made his peace with the gap by not looking at it too directly. He looked at Kai with an expression of careful concern. Mr. Kang, I want to assure you that we take all patient care concerns extremely seriously, and I can promise you that this matter will be fully. I'm recording this, Kai said. He placed his phone on the desk between them, face up, the recording indicator visible. I want you to know that. Hwang looked at the phone, then back at Kai. The expression of careful concern underwent a slight recalibration. My wife, Kai said, is a patient on your 4th floor. She arrived at 4 this morning, 38 weeks pregnant and in active labor. She was assigned to the care of a nurse named Cho Yuna, who, during the course of this morning, physically struck my wife across the face while she was experiencing a contraction and alone in her room. Following the assault, this nurse told my wife that if she reported it, no one would believe her. He paused for precisely long enough to let each piece of that land. I have this in a formal statement from my wife. I have 2 independent staff witnesses who have corroborated elements of the incident. I have a formal police report already on file, and in approximately 20 minutes I'll have a lawyer in this building. Hwang opened his mouth. I'm not finished, Kai said pleasantly. What I am asking for is very clear and very reasonable. I want immediate termination proceedings initiated against Nurse Cho Yuna. I want a full independent investigation into this incident and into the culture of this ward that allowed it to happen. And I want a meeting within 48 hours to discuss specific structural changes to how this hospital protects vulnerable patients, particularly those who may be foreign nationals or who are otherwise in a position where institutional power is not working in their favor. Hwang leaned back. He looked at the phone on the desk. He looked at the wall. He looked at his own hands. Mr. Kang, I have to be transparent with you. Processes of this kind require time and due procedure. There's a union, there are HR protocols, there are. Director Kai's voice did not change. My wife is on your 4th floor right now giving birth with a bruise on her face from an employee of this hospital. She is 38 weeks pregnant. She was alone in her room when it happened because the nurse had deliberately ensured no other staff were present. He leaned forward slightly, just slightly, not as a threat but as a closing of distance, the kind that makes abstraction impossible. I have lawyers, I have time, and I have the kind of media contacts that find systemic hospital abuse stories very interesting. How this proceeds is entirely your decision. The room was quiet. Hwang picked up his desk phone and made a call. He spoke briefly and quietly and put it down. He looked at Kai with the expression of a man who has finished calculating and arrived at the only number that makes sense. I'll initiate a formal review immediately, he said. The personnel matter will be escalated to HR today. I'll have my PA arrange a meeting for Thursday. Kai stood. He picked up his phone and ended the recording. He buttoned his jacket. Thank you, Director, he said. He did not say it with warmth, but he said it with precision, because precision was what was required, and because he had learned long ago that the goal of a negotiation was the outcome, not the atmosphere. He went back to Amara. You're at the midpoint of Amara and Kai's story, and the hardest part is still ahead. If this is the kind of writing that stays with you, share it right now with someone who needs to read it. And if you want to be first to read what comes next, follow this page and turn on notifications. Don't leave Amara alone in this story. Detective Shin arrived at 8:45, which was when the shift had fully changed, and the fourth floor had the more populated, purposeful feeling of the hospital in its daytime mode. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with a gray suit that had been pressed recently and shoes that suggested he had walked a considerable distance to get here, though he showed no evidence of hurrying. He carried a worn leather folder and the expression of someone for whom nothing was ever quite a surprise, not because they were unimaginative, but because they had been paying attention for long enough. He introduced himself at the nursing station and then asked for Amara, who received him between contractions with the same leveled composure she seemed to apply to everything. He sat in the chair. Beside her bed, the same chair Kai had used, the same chair Boyoung used, the one chair in the room, which gave it an almost ceremonial quality, and he asked his questions carefully and in order, writing in his folder with a pen that was too cheap for the quality of his attention. He asked her what happened. He let her describe it fully. He asked 3 clarifying questions, 2 of which were practical and one of which was so precisely chosen that Amara looked at him for a moment before answering, because it was the question that unlocked the detail she hadn't thought to include. He thanked her. He said he would be back if he needed anything further. He was in the corridor when another contraction hit. Amara gripped the rail and Boyoung was there immediately, steady and present, and he waited without looking in, giving her the privacy of it, standing at the wall with his folder closed and his hands patient. He interviewed trainee Sue for 12 minutes. He interviewed the second nurse for 9. He asked them both the same 3 questions about what they had observed and what they had said to whom and why they hadn't said it sooner, and the answers to the third question from both of them independently were variants of the same thing. Who would they have told, and what would have happened to the information? Then he went to the personnel office. He found it in Yuna's file, the first complaint from 2.5 years ago. A patient name he noted. A foreign national, the file categorized almost incidentally. The complaint had been reviewed by the ward supervisor at the time and dismissed as a misunderstanding arising from cultural communication differences. The supervisor who had reviewed it was no longer at the hospital. The patient presumably was long gone. The second complaint was 15 months ago. An elderly patient, Korean, no less institutional power, the complaint filed by a family member, dismissed pending further investigation. No follow-up documented. Shin sat in the personnel office with the file open on the table and looked at it for a moment. He was not a man who expressed strong emotion in professional contexts, but the 2 words he said under his breath to nobody were not in his professional vocabulary. He found Kai in the 4th floor corridor, standing by the window, looking at the car park, waiting with the particular patience of a man who has learned how to wait but has never made peace with it. Mr. Kang. Kai turned. 2 prior complaints, Shin said, both filed, both dismissed. One from a foreign patient, one from an elderly local, neither investigated properly. Kai said nothing. The first one is 2.5 years old, the second is 15 months ago. Shin looked at his folder, then at Kai. This changes the nature of the case. It's a pattern, that's a very different charge sheet than a single incident. Will it be pursued? I intend to pursue it. Shin met his eyes. There are larger questions about the complaint handling culture in this hospital that will need to go above my level, but the direct assault charge is straightforward. I have your wife's testimony, 2 corroborating witnesses, and physical evidence that was documented by the attending midwife within an hour of the incident. He paused. The case is strong. Kai nodded. Shin looked at him for a moment. Do your job, he said, and I'll do mine. He said it without irony. He said it as the kind of statement that means exactly what it sounds like and nothing else. Kai almost smiled. It was a small thing and it lasted less than a second, but Shin caught it. My daughter is going to need me to do my job differently, Kai said, starting today. Shin considered this. What position are you moving to? Kai thought about Sorami's hand around his finger, the absolute trustfulness of it, the grip of someone who doesn't know yet that trust is a calculation. He thought about the kind of world that grip deserved. A better one, he said. I'm working on the specifics. Shin nodded once and walked toward the elevator. Yuna sat in the hospital security office with her hands folded on the table. The room was small and had the aggressively neutral quality of rooms that are designed for conversations no one wants to have. A security officer had offered her water, which she had refused, and then sat down across from her, which she had expected, and then left when his radio called him elsewhere, which she had not. She sat alone for 11 minutes. She did not look at her phone, which was in her pocket and which she knew had 3 unread messages, 2 from her daughter, who would be awake and making breakfast now, and 1 from her lawyer, who called every Thursday. She did not look at it because looking at it would require making her hands move, and her hands were very still on the table, and she needed them to stay that way. She thought about Amara Voss's face when the blow landed. She thought about it with the specific precision of someone who cannot stop thinking about something and has given up trying to look away from it. The shock in it. The absolutely pure, undeserved shock, not of pain, but of the fact of it, the sheer incomprehensible fact that a person in the care of a nurse was being struck by that nurse. She had spent 14 months assembling a version of Kai Kang's wife in her mind, a construct, really, a shape onto which she had stacked every legitimate and illegitimate grievance of the past year and a half. A target that was adjacent to the real target in ways that felt, when she was not sleeping well, which was most nights, like proximity enough. She had told herself she did not intend to do anything. She had told herself that, and then she had been standing in that room, and Amara Voss had said, I understand you're in pain, had said it with the infuriating, composed, undeserved dignity of someone who did not need to be afraid of her, and something in Yuna had simply given way. She thought about her husband. She thought about him with the particular quality of thought that has been worn smooth by repetition, the grooves of it familiar in her mind, his face, the morning they told him, the sound he made. She thought about her children and the apartment they had moved to and the school the youngest had cried for 3 nights about leaving. She thought about the photograph of Amara's bruised face in a medical file, photographed and documented within an hour, already permanent. She thought about what she had done. The door opened, she did not look up. Detective Shin sat down across from her. He placed his folder on the table. He uncapped his pen. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, with the patient, attending quality of someone who does not need the silence to end for his own benefit. Then he said, let's start from the beginning. The afternoon light came through the hospital window at an angle that turned everything gold. The quality of the hour, that particular 4 o'clock light in late autumn, had the weight of a held breath, something at the edge of one thing becoming another. Amara had been in labor for 12 hours. BWAM was beside her, had been beside her through the last 4 of them without leaving except once, briefly, when she had spoken quietly to someone in the corridor and come back with the satisfied expression of a person who has resolved a logistical problem to their precise specifications. The pain was enormous and had been enormous for some time, but it had also become, in the way that sustained extremity sometimes does, almost a kind of clarity. Everything unnecessary had been burned away, and what remained was just this, just her body, just this room, just the work. Kai was on her left side, her hand in both of his. He had come back from the administrator's office and not left since. He had not spoken much, which was right. There was nothing useful to say, and Kai had always understood, better than most people she knew, the distinction between speech and presence. He was present. Completely, undistractedly present, and she felt it the way you feel warmth, not as a thought, but as a physical fact. BWAM said, Amara, are you ready? Amara looked at her. "You're ready," BWAM said, and it was a confirmation, not a question. "Your body has been doing this exactly right for 12 hours. Everything is where it needs to be." She leaned forward. "I need one more thing from you, and then she's here." Amara looked at the ceiling. She thought about all of it, the room at 4 in the morning, the silence, the dead phone, the hand across her face. The call bell, Kai's stillness when he saw her face. BWAM arriving at the corridor's end like a change in weather. All of it leading here to this moment, to this most ordinary and impossible of things. She breathed in. She pushed. Sarami Kang arrived at 4:17 in the afternoon, in the golden light, making the kind of noise that sounds like an argument, and is, in fact, the first statement of a person who intends to take up space in the world and has already made her feelings about that known. BWAM caught her. Her hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 340 times and understood that the count was the least important part. She cleared the airway, checked the position, checked again, and then placed Sorami on Amara's chest in one continuous motion that was so practiced, it looked simple and was anything but. The room went still. Sorami's eyes were open. They were the dark, unfocused eyes of the very newly arrived, not seeing exactly but present, taking in light and warmth and the sound of Amara's heartbeat, which she had been listening to for 38 weeks, in which she recognized, perhaps, the way we recognize things that have always been true. Amara looked at her daughter. She had thought at various points in the preceding hours about what this moment would feel like. She was a person who prepared for things, who thought them through, who liked to have a sense of the emotional landscape ahead. She understood now that she had been completely wrong about it, not in the content but in the scale, the way a photograph of a mountain is accurate in its details and absolutely inadequate as a description of standing at its base. She said nothing, she breathed. Kai rested his forehead very gently against Amara's temple. His eyes were closed. His hands, which had been holding hers, were still. He did not speak, because there was nothing to say that was not already present in the room, in the light, in the weight of the small person on Amara's chest who was, in all the ways that mattered, impossible and inevitable and entirely, absolutely real. BWAM stepped back quietly. She went to the corner of the room and made her notes and let them have the moment, because she had learned, over 2 decades, that this was not her moment to be in, it was theirs, and her job now was to be absent without leaving. Later, the light had gone. The hospital evening had settled in, a quieter mode, the pace adjusted. Amara was asleep, the deep, gone sleep of someone whose body has used every resource it possesses and is now engaged in the serious work of replenishment. BWAM had checked on her twice, made her notes, and gone to the end of the corridor with the satisfied expression of someone who has done their job well and knows it. Kai sat in the chair beside the window. Sorami was on his chest, her face turned toward his neck, her breathing the barely perceptible rise and fall of the very small and very new. He had one hand across her back, not pressing, just present, a shelter rather than a hold. Outside, Seoha City moved in its indifferent nighttime way. The lights of the district below, the distant shapes of the industrial eastern fringe, the ordinary world in its ordinary motion, entirely unaware of what had happened on the 4th floor of Silvergate General this Tuesday. Amara's voice came softly from the bed, still half in sleep. "You should rest." "I'm resting," Kai said. A pause. "You're sitting completely upright." "This is how I rest." She made a sound that might have been a laugh in a different context. Then, after a moment, "What did you want to do when you came in and saw my face?" He was quiet. Outside, a car moved through the street below, its headlights sweeping briefly. "Everything I know how to do," he said. "But you didn't." "No." "Why?" He looked down at Sorami. Her fist, he had noticed, had wrapped around his index finger at some point in the last hour. The grip of it was remarkable, the absolute conviction of it, the way she held on without knowing she was holding, without strategy or intention, purely because holding was what her hand knew to do. "Because she was going to meet me today," he said, "and I needed to be worth meeting." Amara was quiet. He could hear her breathing, still the careful, measured breathing of someone whose body was not yet entirely her own again. You were, she said. He didn't answer. He looked at Sorami's face, at the small specific features of it, the architecture of her, already entirely herself, already someone. He thought about Ro in the corridor and the warehouse and Mun across the table, and the 14 months of trying to become someone different, and all the ways he had been too slow about it, too qualified, too willing to let the urgency of the present defer the change he'd promised. He thought about a father Sorami would read about one day, when she was old enough to look the record of who he was, searchable, permanent, the kind of legacy that outlasts anyone's intention to soften it. He thought about what he wanted that record to say. He thought about the choice he'd made in the corridor outside Amara's room, with every instinct he had pointing in a different direction, and how it had been, genuinely, the easiest hard thing he had ever done. I spoke to Shin before he left, he said. Amara's eyes were still closed, and she's been formally charged. The 2 previous complaints are being reopened. The hospital's complaint suppression is being referred to the medical authority. He paused. It'll take time, but it'll stick. Good. Yeah. Sorami made a small sound, not distress, something else, some navigation between sleep states, the small adjustments of a person getting used to the experience of existing. Kai felt it against his chest, his hand on her back held steady. Shin said I handled it right, he said. You did. He seemed surprised. Were you? He thought about it honestly, the way Amara had taught him to think about things that mattered without the armor of easy answers. A little, he said, for about 4 seconds in the corridor before I made the calls. He turned the thought over, then it was simple. What made it simple? You, he said, and her. He looked at Sorami. And the fact that I've spent 14 months trying to become someone who makes different choices, and this was the first time it actually meant something. Amara opened her eyes. She looked at him across the dim room, at her husband in his dark jacket, in the hospital chair, with their daughter against his chest and his hands spread wide across her back, and the whole complicated history of him visible and settled in his face. It's always meant something, she said, every day. He looked at her, something in his face moved, not much, not demonstratively, but enough. I know, he said, I'm starting to know that better. The following morning Kai met with Director Hwang again, this time with legal counsel on both sides. Attorney Jung said very little and needed to say very little. Hwang had arrived with 2 HR representatives, and the demeanor of someone who had spent the night consulting with people above his authority level, and concluded that the most strategic position available to him was full cooperation. Kai placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. 5 items, written clearly without preamble. An independent patient advocacy program, a dedicated team with no reporting line to the ward supervisor structure, accessible to any patient directly. Anonymous reporting channels for both staff and patients, managed externally with a guaranteed response protocol. Mandatory cultural awareness and anti-discrimination training for all clinical staff, beginning within 90 days. External annual audits of complaint handling with published outcomes. Dedicated patient liaison staff on every ward, responsible for patient welfare independent of treatment staff. Hwang read the list. He looked at Attorney Jung. He looked at his HR representatives who looked back at him with the expressions of people who had assessed the situation and arrived at the same number he had. He signed. Kai folded his copy and put it in his jacket pocket without looking at it. He stood. Attorney Jung gathered her things. This is the beginning of it, not the end, Kai said. I'll be following up. Hwang nodded. He looked for the first time since Kai had met him, like a man who was thinking about something more than optics. In the corridor, Ro was waiting. He fell into step beside Kai without a word. They walked the length of the corridor in silence, past the rooms and the nurses and the ordinary business of a hospital morning. At the elevator, Ro said, "Done." "Started," Kai said. He found Shin at the end of the fourth floor corridor putting on his coat. He saw Kai coming and waited. The charge is filed, Shin said. Assault causing bodily harm. The prior complaint investigations are being handled by an external officer that's above my level, but it's been escalated properly. The medical authority has received the referral on complaint suppression. There will be hearings. Timeline. Months, these things are months. He looked at Kai steadily. But the case is documented, the witnesses are on record, and the physical evidence is in the file. It will probably go home tomorrow. Kai sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his daughter. Sorami's hand was visible at the edge of the blanket, the 5 fingers, their extraordinary smallness, the fact of them. I want to move, he said. Amara looked at him. Not far, different neighborhood maybe, somewhere quieter, somewhere she can. He stopped, started again. I've been winding things down for 14 months. After this week, I'm going to wind them down faster. He looked at Amara directly. I'm telling you now, not asking because it's already decided. I'm decided. Amara looked at him for a long moment. The morning light came through the open window and moved across the floor. You've been decided for 14 months, she said quietly. You just needed a reason that was louder than the reasons to wait. Yes. She's loud enough. She is. He looked at Sorami again, at her face, which had already in 3 days acquired the. Kai looked at her and held very still. He had spent 15 years building a life that nothing could touch, agreements and leverage, and the careful architecture of being someone that people calculated the cost of crossing. He had built it methodically, and he had built it well, and it had never, not once, made him feel the way this room felt right now, the way this weight on his chest felt right now, the way his wife's hand over his felt right now. He had thought for a long time that what he was building was strength. He understood now, in this room, in this light, with this particular person against his chest, that he had been building something else entirely, the appearance of strength, the infrastructure of it, the performance, not the thing itself. The thing itself was here. The thing itself was this. The willingness to stay, the willingness to be known, the willingness to sit in a hospital chair in the small hours of the morning. Understood for the first time that he had never actually been building anything at all. Until now. If this story moved you, if Amara's courage or Kai's choice stayed with you, then it did exactly what it was written to do. Don't let it end here. Share it with someone who needs this message today. Before you go, tell me in the comments, which moment hit you the hardest and what lesson are you taking away? I read every comment and I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more unforgettable stories that inspire, challenge, and stay with you long after they end, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story might be the one that changes everything. Until next time, thank you for watching.